If you're looking to put together an offer for a business through the Business Brokers of Florida, here's a quick highlight of some information. I want people to always remember, get an accountant, get an attorney to get you the support, and work with the broker or the intermediary to make sure you're filling this type of thing out right. But this gives you an overview of some of the things you're going to need to know. So first of all, you're going to buy it in your name, whatever that name is, or if you've already set up a corporation. If you're new to Florida or you don't know or have a corporation, you could go to sunbiz, sunbiz.com or .org, and get the information and fill out the form. You can also get the help of an attorney or an accountant to fill that out. The seller's name should already be put together and they should already have their corporation. Again, I'm using a fake biz here. And then you're going to decide on what you want to offer totally for the money and what you're going to put down as a deposit. Usually it's going to be held by an escrow attorney. Our office generally uses an outside attorney that's an escrow agent that does the closing. Remember, a closing agent generally does not represent the buyer or the seller, just the closing process. So remember to get an attorney and get an accountant whenever you need help, and also work with your broker. Anyway, you're going to put together the information and fill it all out so you get a total price. You might have a cashier's check at the closing. You might be assuming a promissory note or have the seller hold some financing for the business. And if you're doing a bank loan, then you're just going to have that cashier's check already there, and you don't explain the bank loan in this portion of the contract for this particular form. Make sure your offer has a written acceptance ending date so that you don't have to continually waiting for them to get back to you. Make it specific, put the time on there, AM, PM, and the date it would be has to get back to you, or this goes null and void and you move on to another offer. Also have a closing date. If you're using an SBA loan, you might need to reach out 60 days or so, and even give yourself some room to extend, because sometimes even hardworking banks get stuck in a situation such as when maybe the hurricane is coming and they can't do the insurance for a while and everything gets held off. So give yourself some flexibility. You can always close before. Usually the contracts will say shall be on or before a specific date. So reach out kind of far, but make everybody comfortable. Remember that time is all of the essence, and you're going to say that you as a buyer and the seller are both signing to say that you have the responsibility and the ability to go through the process. Get a due diligence list together. I highly recommend that you put together your accountant and your attorney team early on in the process, and your broker if you like, and then make sure that you have a due diligence list that's accurate. So at the time of making this offer, you can say, hey, I want to make this offer, but I need to see these items. And if I can't become totally satisfied with these items, then for whatever reason, I'm not going to buy this business. And you can see a contract to be canceled in every respect if you're not buyer, sole, complete, and personal satisfaction shall have the contract canceled. Okay, there's going to be other contingencies like getting a lease if there's a rental, or buying the land if there's land, or maybe sometimes it's home base and there's neither one of those things. Also, if you're an international buyer, you need to make sure you get a visa subject to this, and a few other things that might come around. But due diligence, the other one would probably be if there was a franchise involved. Okay, so default means that you guys are both responsible, and you're not going to be able to default on that. Read the detail of all this. I'm just going over this really quickly. You check here if there's going to be a contract that's contingent on getting an SBA loan or some other third-party thing, and put down, hey, I'm going to reach out to the bank within, I don't know, 3 calendar days. All right. Hopefully you've already been talking to a bank and gotten yourself pre-qualified, and then you'll have a period of time to get a letter that says it's acceptable. A written loan commitment, it doesn't mean you're at the end of the line. So maybe you give yourself 30 or 40 days to get the loan commitment letter from the bank. Of course, then you still have to go get the final approval and go to the closing, etc. There's going to be a security agreement if there's a seller note on the business, and the attorney is going to do all that, and a good attorney doing the closing will also do a lien search and do background, but make sure that you are also doing a thorough job on your own of due diligence, inventory of goods and items. Quite often businesses that have inventory, the seller has already said, hey, this will come with $50,000 worth of inventory or some number, right? And yet you can't predict 2 months out exactly how much is going to be in the coffers. And this explains your choices of doing a physical inventory and then changing the price, or adding it to a note if there's a seller note. I talk about accounts receivable. In some cases, when you buy a business, you need to have enough working capital. This is one of the formats. It usually isn't as strong or likely for smaller businesses. Certainly businesses over $1 million, it needs to be part of the conversation, and stuff in between that should also be part of the conversation, just so you know what you're getting into. Accounts, the fictitious name. So whatever the business's name on, Quite often you're going to say, yeah, I want to have that fictitious name if you want to change it later on. Seller's indemnification, the buyer's rights. Again, read all this stuff and go through it with the attorney. I'm just looking for the parts where you fill in the blanks. Quite often the business deposits, such as the rent down and the utility bills down, is going to go back to the original person that owned the business, and you yourself are going to put your own deposits down. Same thing applies to mail, business records. You should get a copy of all that. There's sometimes when you close, such as maybe in the middle of a month regarding a rent that's already been paid, and so there's going to be proration, meaning that, hey, you're taking over the middle of the month, the seller is already paid for the month, and so you're going to reimburse the seller for the remaining half of the month that's left out there. Make sure licenses and permits are out there and make sure everything's done well. Regarding familiarization, usually there's a time period when the seller's going to stick around and you need to decide, hey, how long would make sense? Usually I have a conversation between the buyer and the seller and saying, Ms. or Mr. or whatever seller, what do you already know about the business? What do you feel like you're going to need? And then from the buyer's standpoint, rather, and that the seller then decides how they're going to break down the training and the transition of the process, okay? A restrictive covenant is really important as well. So if you have like a single location where people come to, maybe a barber shop or something like that, maybe people will travel 10 miles or so and they're not going to come to you. You really don't have to worry about 50 or 100 or 150 miles in most cases. If you've got an online business where you're selling on the internet, then you need to think through that process of what you want that seller to do in terms of staying out of the business altogether and for how long and for what geographic means, etc. Make sure that you're putting in reasonable and enforceable numbers out there. When you get to numbers that are too high or too crazy or too unenforceable, maybe asking for 10 or 15 years never to be in the business, the law might find out that that's unenforceable, and it might really mess things up a little bit. So make sure you've got the right information. Again, that's where you have a conversation with your attorney to make sure you're doing the right thing. The allocation of purchase price is an IRS issue, and this is where you need to talk to your attorney or your accountant rather, and decide, like, hey, I paid $1 million for the business, and $100,000 would go towards non-compete. $500,000 would go towards the business and goodwill. $400,000 would go to inventory or what have you. So go through the details of understanding what that is and make sure that you're going to be able to get the lease assigned to you or get a new lease. Remember that there's a closing attorney. Quite often the closing attorney doesn't represent the buyer or the seller, although in some cases a buyer has an attorney, the seller has an attorney, and they close it separately. But quite often there's a middle closing attorney, sort of like a title company for a house or something like that. Typically the fees are split 50-50 between the buyer and seller, but do get an idea from the closing attorney how much that's going to cost approximately. They can't tell you maybe to the penny sometimes, but they can say, hey, is it going to be about $1,000 a side or what have you, okay? Go through the process, the attorney fees, the court fees, and understand, just read this document. I don't want to go on too long about it. Environmental usually applies more towards businesses that have real estate tied to it, tax closure, real property termination, etc. And then buyer's deposit instructions, so you can have the deposit made out there. And then if there's brokers involved, how their information is tied into it as well. And then make sure you sign the right documentation. Each page usually has a place for the buyer to sign or put an initial, and the seller to sign. And then it's a binding offer, so you put a date on there. You're going to buy this as an individual, but later on you can switch to a corporation if you want, so you don't have to wait for that. Fill in your information, sign it, and then there's room for the seller to accept it. However, the seller might decide to reject it. That would be sad. Or the seller might say, I like pretty much the offer, but I do want to make sure that you understand I'm going to be on vacation in Alaska for 2 weeks during the process, and I won't be able to help you out, or whatever you need out there. And then the seller can say, okay, I'm countering the offer, and the buyer can accept the offer or what have you. Okay, that's all we got. Sorry for so long. Thank you. Bye-bye.